Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. What happens when the truth you've spent your entire life believing in suddenly unravels? What if the people you trust most are hiding the darkest secrets about your past and your future? Diep thought she had finally found peace. But what if everything she knew was a lie? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking twists that will leave you questioning everything. Will Diep overcome the betrayal, or is this just the beginning of an even darker journey? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 followers. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Diep sat motionless in the sterile, white-walled office, her fingers nervously gripping the edge of the examination table. The doctor's words felt like cold stones dropping into her chest, each syllable sinking deeper into her heart. "You have cataracts, Diep," he said quietly. "There is a high chance you could lose your sight in the coming months." Her eyes went wide, the world around her suddenly feeling distant and blurred. The doctor continued speaking, but his voice seemed muffled, drowned out by the roar of her own thoughts. How could this be happening? She was still young. This wasn't supposed to happen now. The weight of the news seemed to press down on her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. The doctor's calm tone contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions brewing inside her. His words seemed detached, almost clinical, but for Diep they carried the weight of a future she hadn't prepared for. She couldn't focus on the technicalities, the medical terms, the options laid out before her. All she could hear was the echo of his final statement, the one that pierced through everything. "You could lose your sight." A sudden rush of heat swept over her, and she instinctively reached for her face, as if to confirm that her eyes were still there, still working. The reality of her condition didn't feel real yet. She couldn't process it. How could she? How could anyone? The fear that gripped her heart spread to every fiber of her being, choking her thoughts, leaving her with nothing but an overwhelming sense of loss. Outside the window, the rain began to fall, the sound of it growing louder with each passing second, a steady patter against the glass. It was as though nature itself was mourning with her, accompanying her in her grief. She looked out at the gray sky, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her eyes slowly moved to the reflection in the window, barely recognizing the face staring back at her. But it wasn't just the fear of losing her sight that haunted her. There was something more. A nagging, growing suspicion that clung to the back of her mind like a shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no mere coincidence, that her condition was somehow linked to a much darker force. Her secretary, with her cold demeanor and cryptic behavior, loomed in her thoughts. What if this wasn't just an illness? What if someone had orchestrated it, set it all in motion, knowing that the damage would be irreversible? She didn't know for sure, but the possibility gnawed at her insides. She glanced around the sterile office, the walls closing in around her as the doubts grew louder. The secretary's strange behavior, the whispers, the unexplained tension. It was all too much to ignore. Was it possible that someone had conspired to ruin her life, to take her sight, to make her feel powerless? The doctor continued to explain the options: surgery, treatment, time. But all Diep could hear was the pounding of the rain outside, mirroring the chaos inside her. The world she once knew was slipping away, and with it, the hope that had once felt so certain. Diep stood in the hallway of her apartment, her hand gently tracing the edge of the door frame. The dim light from the hallway flickered slightly, adding an eerie quality to the silence surrounding her. She closed her eyes, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside her. But it was impossible. The memories came rushing back, uninvited, like a flood breaking through a broken dam. She remembered the pain of abandonment, the way she had cried herself to sleep as a child, wondering why her parents weren't there, the unanswered questions, the loneliness that gnawed at her every day, never quite leaving her. Her childhood had been filled with shadows, an endless search for the love and comfort that should have been given to her by her family. She had tried to move past it, but some wounds, no matter how many years pass, never heal completely. "Why did they leave me?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet apartment. It was a question she had asked herself countless times over the years. Why didn't they love me enough to stay? The tears she had shed as a little girl felt as fresh as ever. She had grown up learning to live without her parents, to survive on her own, but the hurt remained. It wasn't just the absence of her parents, but the rejection that had broken her. They had chosen to walk away, leaving her with nothing but unanswered questions and an aching heart. "Don't you love me anymore?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking under the weight of the question. She closed her eyes again, as if to block out the images that flooded her mind. Her parents, their backs turned to her, disappearing into the darkness without a single glance back. Suddenly, she was pulled out of her thoughts by the sound of a phone ringing, the sharp noise piercing the stillness of the apartment. She reached for her phone with a trembling hand, seeing James's name on the screen. His concern for her was palpable, but it only made her feel more alone, more distant from the life she had once dreamed of. "Diep," his voice came through the phone, soft but filled with worry. "Are you okay? I was thinking about you. Why don't you take the day off? I don't want you overworking yourself." Diep could hear the sincerity in his voice, but the words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. She wanted to reach out to tell him everything, but the weight of her own emotions held her back. "I'm fine," she said, her voice cold and distant. "Just tired, that's all." But deep inside, she wasn't fine. She was breaking. And it wasn't just because of the physical pain she was enduring now. It was the realization that everything she had ever known had been a lie. Her parents had abandoned her, and she was left to pick up the pieces of a broken life. The rain beat relentlessly against the windows, the soft, rhythmic sound almost comforting in its persistence. James stood by the door of Diep's apartment, his hand lingering on the knob, hesitating. He had always known that Diep carried burdens. He had seen the way her eyes clouded over sometimes, the way she flinched when certain topics were brought up. But he had never imagined it was this deep. She had always been so strong, so composed. But now, standing there, he felt helpless. He had tried calling her earlier, but she hadn't answered. The unease gnawed at him as he finally pushed the door open, his heart sinking when he saw her sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, eyes distant. She hadn't even bothered to change out of the clothes she'd worn all day, as if she didn't care anymore. His heart ached at the sight. "Diep," he called softly, crossing the room to stand in front of her. He reached out, gently lifting her chin to meet his gaze. Her eyes were dull, not the vibrant spark he was used to. She looked like she had aged years in just one night. "I know you're hurting," James said, his voice low and full of empathy. "But you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Diep pulled her gaze away, her face twisting in discomfort. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. Not when her heart felt so torn. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. James knelt in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "Tell me, what's going on?" Her breath hitched as the words tumbled out. "I found out my parents. They're not alive. They left me. They abandoned me 25 years ago, and now..." Her voice trailed off, the grief consuming her once again. "Now I'm losing my sight, James. Everything is slipping away from me and I can't stop it." James's heart twisted as he watched the tears form in her eyes. He had always known that Diep carried a weight with her. But to hear the pain in her voice, to see the torment she had been hiding, it shattered him. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his hand reaching out to gently cradle her face. "I don't know how it feels, but I know you don't have to face this alone. I'm here, Diep. I will always be here." Diep shook her head, pulling back slightly. "But what if it's not just me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if someone is doing this to me? What if my condition isn't just a coincidence? What if someone is trying to hurt me?" James froze. He hadn't considered that possibility, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed plausible. Diep's secretary had always been distant, often acting in strange ways that left James feeling uneasy. Could she be involved in something more sinister? "I won't let anything happen to you," James promised, his voice firm. "I'll make sure we get to the bottom of this. You don't have to go through this alone, not now, not ever." But Diep wasn't so sure. The thought of someone she trusted betraying her, of a hidden enemy lurking in the shadows, sent a chill down her spine. How much of her life had been a lie? How much of what she had built, what she had worked for, was truly hers to keep? As James reached out to hold her, she felt a flicker of hope. Small, fragile, but enough to keep her from completely drowning in despair. Maybe, just maybe, they could face the storm together. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew that the path ahead would be filled with more pain, more uncertainty. And this time, she wasn't sure if even James's love would be enough to save her. The rain continued to pour, now accompanied by flashes of distant thunder. The tension in the apartment thickened, as if the storm outside was mirrored by the turmoil within. Diep, despite her best efforts, couldn't shake the overwhelming wave of emotions crashing over her. She felt as though her mind and body were waging a silent war, torn between the past that had broken her and the present that threatened to shatter what little peace she had left. James, still kneeling in front of her, could feel the weight of her distress. His hand gently gripped hers, trying to offer her something, anything, to anchor her in this moment. But Diep's eyes, filled with pain and confusion, were somewhere else. Her gaze wandered to the window, watching the torrents of rain as if it could wash away the memories, the fears, the reality that was slowly consuming her. Suddenly, without warning, Diep's body went limp, her head tilting back as she slumped in her seat. James caught her just in time, his heart racing as he carefully laid her down on the floor. Panic surged through him. Diep, he cried, shaking her gently, his voice filled with alarm. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. He knew she had been under immense stress, but this was beyond anything he could have anticipated. His mind raced. Should he call an ambulance? Should he try to do something? The helplessness he felt at that moment was suffocating. "Come on, Diep," he muttered, desperation in his voice. "Please, stay with me. I need you to wake up." For what felt like an eternity, James stayed by her side, holding her hand, willing her to come back to him. The minutes stretched into an hour, but slowly, Diep's eyes fluttered open. She blinked, confusion clouding her gaze, before her eyes locked onto James. His relief was palpable, but so was his fear. "What happened? Are you okay?" he asked gently, brushing a strand of wet hair from her forehead. Diep's throat was dry, and she could barely manage a whisper. I'm sorry," she murmured. "I don't know what's happening to me." James frowned, his worry deepening. "You don't have to apologize, but we need to get you checked out. This isn't just stress, Diep. Something's wrong. I won't let you go through this alone." Diep turned her head away, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm scared, James. I don't know what's real anymore. The truth about my parents, my sight, and now this." Her voice trailed off, barely audible. James knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "You don't have to do this alone. Whatever this is, we'll face it together." Diep took a shaky breath, trying to gather her strength. She didn't know how much more she could take. The past seemed to be swallowing her whole, and the present felt like an endless storm she couldn't escape from. But James's words were like a lifeline in the darkness, offering her a glimpse of something she hadn't dared hope for in so long. Safety, peace, and love. But even as she clung to that flicker of hope, the question lingered. Was the storm outside, was the storm in her life really over? Or was it just beginning? The apartment was eerily silent after Diep's collapse, save for the distant rumbling of thunder and the constant patter of the rain outside. Diep lay in bed, her eyes closed as she tried to regain some semblance of strength, though the fear she felt deep inside made it hard to rest. James sat in a chair beside her, his gaze fixed on her face, though his thoughts were far away. Diep's collapse had shaken him, but it was the fear of losing her, of watching her slip away from him, both physically and emotionally, that truly terrified him. He had been through so much in his life, but this felt different. This felt like something much more sinister was unfolding, something he couldn't control. "Why didn't you tell me?" James whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He wasn't talking to Diep. He was speaking to the lingering shadows of doubt that had taken root in his heart. He had tried to comfort her, to offer her solace, but now the question gnawed at him. What if this wasn't just a medical condition? What if there was something more? Something dark lurking beneath the surface? Diep stirred, her eyes flickering open. She caught James's gaze, but there was a faint look of distrust in her eyes that made his chest tighten. The unease that had plagued him since the discovery of her condition only seemed to deepen. It was as if a wall had formed between them, and despite his best efforts, he couldn't break through. "James, I'm sorry," Diep whispered, her voice weak. "I didn't mean to worry you." James reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles gently. "You don't need to apologize, Diep, but I need to know the truth." His voice was steady, yet the quiet urgency was undeniable. "What happened with your parents? Why did they leave you? And now this, your sight. What if this isn't just some illness?" Diep's heart skipped a beat. She'd always known that there were things left unsaid, secrets buried deep within her that she had never dared to uncover. She'd always feared the truth, but now, with James pushing her, with everything coming to a head, she couldn't deny it anymore. I don't know what happened with them," she said slowly, her voice filled with sorrow. "I was just a child when they disappeared. But there's something about my condition, something that feels wrong. I don't think it's just a coincidence, James. I think someone's behind this. Someone wants to hurt me, and I think it's my secretary." James's eyes widened. "Your secretary? What makes you think that?" "I don't know," Diep replied, shaking her head in frustration. "It's just a feeling, a suspicion I've had for a while. I've noticed things that don't add up. I can't prove it, but something tells me she's involved in all of this." James took a deep breath, trying to process what she was saying. His mind raced. Could someone so close to him, someone who worked alongside him every day, really be capable of such treachery? The thought was unfathomable, but as the possibility lingered, he knew that they couldn't ignore it. If Diep was right, they were facing something much darker than either of them could have imagined. "Then we need to get to the bottom of this," James said, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll help you, Diep. No matter what it takes, I'll help you figure out the truth." Diep's eyes softened, a small hint of gratitude flickering within them. "I don't know what I would do without you," she murmured, the words laced with emotion. James squeezed her hand, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. As much as he wanted to believe that everything would be okay, he knew they were just at the beginning of a much larger mystery, one that threatened to unravel everything they had built. But no matter what, he wouldn't let her face it alone. "I'll never leave you, Diep," he whispered. "We'll face this together." But even as he said the words, a dark thought crossed his mind. If Diep's suspicions were right, who could they trust? How much of their lives had been manipulated by the very people they thought they could trust the most? The storm outside raged on, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside their hearts. The days that followed were filled with quiet tension, the kind that lingers in the air, heavy and oppressive. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, as though nature itself was mourning with Diep. She had never felt more alone, yet more aware of her fragility. The possibility that her secretary could be involved in her suffering weighed heavily on her, pushing her further into a maze of doubt and fear. James, though steadfast in his resolve, could not ignore the growing unease that clouded their every interaction. They both knew that they couldn't continue like this, not with the questions that loomed over them, not with the creeping suspicion that someone they trusted might be betraying them. James had decided that they needed answers, no matter where they led. One morning, he asked Diep to meet with him at the office. "We need to confront this head-on," he said, his tone quiet but resolute. "I've been thinking a lot, and I need to get to the bottom of what's happening. If it's her, we need proof. If it's something else, we'll deal with it together." Diep hesitated, but she knew he was right. Every day she spent avoiding the truth felt like one more day wasted in her descent into uncertainty. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." They drove to the office together in silence, the car's tires slicing through the rain-slicked streets, the atmosphere thick with unspoken thoughts. As they approached the building, Diep's heart began to race. She hadn't been there in a while, and she knew the familiar walls would now feel more like a cage than a sanctuary. The secretary's office was just down the hall, and Diep could almost feel the distance between them growing with each step. Once inside, James made a beeline for the secretary's desk, his eyes scanning the room as though expecting to find something out of place. The office was immaculate, the desk meticulously arranged, but there was something unsettling about its sterile perfection. James sat down, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the desk. Diep stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt like a stranger in a place that had once felt like home. She glanced at the desk once more, her eyes catching on a folder that seemed to have been left intentionally askew. With a glance toward James, she stepped forward and opened it. The contents were chilling. Documents related to her medical condition, an odd collection of charts and reports that she had never seen before. There were also a series of notes, some handwritten in an unfamiliar scrawl that detailed her appointments, her health updates, and, most disturbingly, her recent decline in health. James leaned over, his eyes narrowing as he skimmed the papers. "This is..." His voice trailed off, disbelief settling over his features. "Diep, these are your medical records, but they don't seem right. And these notes, someone's been following you more closely than we thought." Diep's heart sank as the realization hit her. It wasn't just that her secretary had known about her condition. It was that she had been monitoring her every move, every appointment. This was no coincidence. "James," Diep said, her voice trembling, "I knew it. I knew there was something wrong. This isn't just a disease. Someone's been orchestrating this." James clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening with anger. "We need to confront her, Diep, now." The two of them moved quickly, their determination growing stronger with each step. When they reached the secretary's office, Diep's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of confronting the woman who had been manipulating her life, or of what they would discover next. The door to the secretary's office creaked open slowly, and there she was, sitting behind her desk, a look of surprise on her face as she looked up from her computer. "Diep, James, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice too calm, too practiced. Diep took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, though her heart was racing. "We know what you've been doing," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "You've been tracking my health, my appointments, manipulating things behind my back. Why? Why would you do this to me?" The secretary didn't flinch, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're just paranoid, Diep." James stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "Don't lie. We have the proof. We know everything." For a moment there was silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then the secretary's demeanor shifted. She stood up, a cold smile creeping across her face. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you're up against. This is far from over." Diep's blood ran cold. She had been right all along. There was more to this than just her failing eyesight. There was an entire web of deceit, and they were only just beginning to uncover its depths. The tension in the room was suffocating. Diep's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the secretary, her calm demeanor now fully replaced with an unsettling confidence. The woman's words hung in the air like a dark omen. "This is far from over," she repeated, her tone cold, almost mocking. James stepped forward, his expression hardening. "What do you mean by that?" His voice was low, but filled with an edge that betrayed his anger and concern. The secretary's smile widened slightly, her eyes flashing with a mix of amusement and something darker. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," she said, walking around the desk and facing Diep directly. "Your little world, your perfect life, it's all built on lies, and I'm the one who holds the key to it all." Diep recoiled slightly, her mind racing to make sense of her words. The secretary's cryptic statements were not just threats. They were carefully placed seeds of doubt, designed to make her question everything she thought she knew. "Why are you doing this?" Diep asked, her voice strained, a mix of fear and determination. She had come to terms with the idea that her family had abandoned her, but now it seemed as though there was an even greater conspiracy at play. The secretary's expression softened, as if she had been waiting for Diep to ask the question. "Because," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm the one who controls everything. The company, your health, your fate. I was always meant to be in control, and now you're just a pawn in my game." James stepped in between them, his face a mask of fury. "No more games. If you're behind this, I'll make sure you pay for what you've done." The secretary's eyes flickered with something close to amusement. "You think you can stop me?" she said, almost laughing. "You're just as trapped as she is. You have no idea how deep this runs." Diep felt a chill seep into her bones. The words rang with a terrifying truth. She'd always suspected something was wrong, but hearing it from the secretary's lips made everything feel so real, so imminent. Before she could respond, the secretary's phone rang, breaking the tense silence. She looked at the screen and then back at them, her eyes narrowing. "You're not the only ones who've been making plans," she said with a smirk. "I've got people who will make sure you never expose the truth." Diep and James exchanged a quick glance, the gravity of the situation hitting them both at once. They were in much deeper than they had realized. This wasn't just about Diep's health or the betrayal of her family. This was about power, control, and manipulation on a scale neither of them had ever imagined. James reached for Diep's hand, gripping it tightly. "We'll figure this out, I promise. Whatever it takes, we'll get to the truth." Diep nodded, but doubt lingered in her mind. The more she thought about what the secretary had said, the more she realized how fragile everything she had built truly was. The secretary, sensing the shift in the room, took a step back, her smile widening. "You think you're ready for the truth? You're not even close. But don't worry, it won't be long before everything comes crashing down. You'll see soon enough." The door clicked open and a figure stepped inside. It was one of the company's executives, a man Diep had seen only in passing. His eyes were cold, calculating, and he looked from the secretary to Diep and James with a barely concealed sense of superiority. "Everything all right here?" the man asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. Diep's stomach dropped. It was as if the walls of her reality were closing in around her. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and what they revealed was more terrifying than she had imagined. The people she had trusted, the company she had worked for, the life she had been building, they were all part of a much darker scheme. "No, it's not all right," James said firmly, his voice full of resolve. "We're getting to the bottom of this and no one is stopping us." But as the man's gaze narrowed, Diep couldn't help but feel that they were no longer in control. The game was just beginning, and the rules had changed. The storm outside raged louder, as if mirroring the storm within their lives. As they left the office, Diep's mind raced. There was so much she didn't know, so much she had to uncover. But what scared her most wasn't just the people who were trying to destroy her. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as strong as she thought. James's presence beside her was the only thing that kept her grounded. But even that comfort felt fragile, as if they were both dangling on the edge of something they could no longer control.
James, một người đàn ông thành đạt, xây dựng một biệt thự triệu đô cho Diệp, người phụ nữ anh yêu và ước mơ trong một tương lai hoàn hảo cùng nhau. Tuy nhiên, Diệp mắc phải một cơn sốt cao và có nguy cơ bị mất thị lực. James rơi vào lo sợ và bất lực khi anh chăm sóc cô, suy nghĩ về những phục hồi của Diệp và quá khứ chưa được giải quyết, ám ảnh anh giữa những cái căng thẳng đó. Một tiết lộ bất ngờ về cha mẹ thất lạc của Diệp khiến tình cảm cả hai thêm phần rối ren. Diệp kiên quyết cầu nguyện cho phục hồi của Diệp và hứa sẽ luôn ở bên cô bất kỳ điều gì xảy ra.